The 2017 Battlefront 2 is really an interesting game. To say that it had a turbulent launch would be an understatement, with it being ripe in controversy over loot boxes and the heavy focus on microtransaction progression, all of which was only made worse by EA acting like the problem was with the consumer. Yet, over 2 years later, it was announced that the game would no longer be releasing new content, leading to many members of the community saying they are literally willing to throw money at EA to buy new content for the game. But just how did the game go from having one of the worst starts in video game history to it becoming so loved? Considering the numerous controversies the game had in its early life, I do feel that it is kind of ironic that Battlefront 2 was first announced by EA's CFO during an earnings call in May 2016. A lot of bold promises were made about how the game would have lots of bigger and better worlds, but after the initial announcement there wasn't really any substantial reveals about the game. Up until January 2017, when the EA Star Wars Twitter page started to push the idea that this game would have far more content than the first game in EA's reboot of Battlefront. The Twitter account stated how the game would have easily more than 3 times the amount of content than the previous entry in the series, with it featuring a new single player campaign. This did seem to get people excited, although there was a certain amount of doubt around these promises being made by EA. After all, the first game in the reboot series was a massive disappointment to many. The proper reveal for the game came during the 2017 Celebration Star Wars, with EA dropping the reveal trailer. This trailer was well received, with it seeming to show us everything we wanted from the first EA Battlefront. It showed us a full-fledged campaign, space battles, and all 3 of the big Star Wars eras. To make things even better, the creative director of the game heavily suggested that there would be no season passes. This excited many people, and made many others deeply worried about what EA would do instead of season passes. We would later find out that we would be getting all post-release DLCs for free, with the first being a tie-in to The Last Jedi. We would also find out that the game would release on November 17th, 2017, with those who pre-ordered getting the game 3 days early. However, at this point we hadn't even seen any real gameplay, so we had no idea if it would just be the exact same as the previous Battlefront. This would change at EA Play when the first multiplayer gameplay trailer was released, as well as a livestream which featured gameplay of the new multiple phase mode, Galactic Assault on Naboo. I think the fact that they showed a Clone Wars match rather than a Galactic Civil War match or a sequel era match shows how aware EA was of the criticisms of how the Clone Wars was missing from the first Battlefront, and how they were determined to show that this game would not make the same mistakes. We got to see all of the main 4 classes being played across both the CIS and the Republic, as well as some of the special classes and a nice variety of ground, air and vehicle combat. One of the most welcome changes announced was that instead of heroes and vehicles being locked behind random pickups, they would now instead be purchasable with a new battle point system where you earned more points in the game the better you did. We also got to see some of the heroes and villains, with it being discovered that heroes and villains would not be locked by era, since Boba Fett, Rey and Han Solo featured in the Clone Wars match gameplay. This did annoy a part of the community since it did break immersion a lot. I would say the livestream was pretty well received, with it seemingly showing that a lot of the major gameplay problems from the first game would be fixed within the new release, and only went to really build hype for the game. However, many decided to wait off until playing the beta before making judgments on the gameplay. Speaking of the beta, it would release on the 6th of October of the same year for PC, Xbox One and PS4. Originally the beta was supposed to go on until the 6th, but it became so popular it was extended until the 11th. Almost everyone, me included, seemed to be loving the multiplayer gameplay, with having a game mode for each era, with it featuring Galactic Assault on Naboo, as shown in the livestream earlier in the year, the smaller game mode of Strike set on Takodana in the sequel trilogy era, and a space battle set above Fondor during the Galactic Civil War. However, the beta also set off massive red flags of the star card system. Being able to customise classes of star cards wasn't so much of a problem, but what was a problem was that they were obtainable through loot boxes. While loot boxes have had a bad stigma to them for a very long time, it's important to remember that 2017 was when loot boxes were at their most prevalent, and when the annoyance at loot boxes started to turn into straight out contempt and hatred from the gaming community, with them being seen as a way for greedy developers or publishers to scam players out of their hard-earned money. The widespread backlash to the game having loot boxes didn't actually begin with the beta, as while many people were annoyed at the inclusion of them, the beta did keep clearly stating that the system was incomplete and heavily subject to change, leaving many with the hope it would be a fair and balanced system. Of course this would not be the case, and we all know EA was to blame. Players' worst fears of the loot box system would be confirmed in early November when players who'd gotten the game through EA Access began to complain about the balance of the game, with it being heavily tilted towards buying loot crates or being forced to grind for hours to have an even footing in the multiplayer. These players revealed that the beta had been very careful to hide the full extent of the loot box implementation, with them being a vital part of the multiplayer progression. They also complained about how little credits you earned in a match when compared to the just utterly ludicrously ridiculous price of the heroes in the game. This led to the game being widely accused of being a pay-to-win game, and no one could really have predicted the significance the reaction to loot boxes in Battlefront 2 would have on not just the game, but the entire gaming industry. You see, the gaming community is one which in all due honesty is very divided. Many gamers will argue to great length about games and consoles, mainly because everyone has different tastes and opinions, but if there is one thing which unites gamers, it's when someone tries to screw with gamers as a whole. For example, when games force microtransactions on them. To be honest, it was sort of heartwarming to see gamers actually almost be in complete agreement over something, which is truly a rare occurrence. Battlefront 2 was not the first mainstream game to have loot boxes in the last few years, with Call of Duty, Halo and FIFA to just name a few having all adopted a loot box system, and while those games have been heavily criticised, and rightly so, none of them got anywhere near the backlash that Battlefront 2 got. You see, most of the criticisms of Battlefront 2's loot box system were prevalent in those games too. Complaints that it advertised to kids? Well, FIFA has a massive child audience too. Is a forced part of the multiplayer experience, giving unfair advantages? Same thing applies to Halo 5. Yet somehow Battlefront 2 was what got the most attention from the media and governments. If I was to theorise why this was, I would say it was partly due to the fact that Battlefront is a Star Wars game, and Disney, a company which makes a lot of child-friendly content, owns the IP for it. Whatever the reason, Battlefront 2 started a chain reaction which blew up in EA's face. So many media organisations joined in calling out EA, and it got so bad that even governments started to get involved, and still to this day there is a fierce debate over the nature of loot boxes and whether or not they are gambling. Soon, the sheer amount of complaints became far too much for EA to simply ignore, and they were forced to take action, possibly due to pressure from Disney. The result was that EA was forced to backtrack on some of the monetization features. The way they did this was by drastically dropping the cost of heroes and temporarily removing all microtransactions. EA would later announce that they were going to completely rework the implementation of microtransactions by stopping the game from being pay to win and star cards being changed so that they were acquired through means other than loot boxes. Things did seem to be somewhat calming down until later on in the month when EA's CFO made a number of statements that showed they were fully aware of the reasoning behind the outrage, but that they simply didn't care as long as it didn't affect their income. The CFO literally stated that the company had not given up on microtransactions in their games. This was also the event where the CFO said the reason they didn't focus on cosmetic microtransactions like say Overwatch was that they didn't want to break canon, saying no one wanted Darth Vader in white or pink. This really did just seem like a dumb excuse by EA, since being canon-friendly was clearly never their intention here, and this made it sound like there weren't dozens of canon-friendly skins that some characters could have. Oh, and of course this led to people wanting a pink Darth Vader. EA would suffer greatly from the Battlefront 2 loot box debacle, with them greatly missing their revenue predictions for the next quarter following the game's release, as well as them becoming the 5th most hated company in America. EA even made it clear that they were now fully aware that they could not make such a massive mistake again. All of this led to the game having a bad stigma before, during and after launch, which as stated earlier did affect the game's financial and critical performance. The game released on the 17th of November 2017, with it having 15 maps with a variety of large battles and small skirmishes set in space and on the ground. The maps felt varied and were filled with little details which made them enjoyable to play and explore. It also helped that the gameplay was greatly improved from the first game, with aiming actually being effective now rather than everyone just running around and hip-firing at each other. And of course, visually, the game was just utterly beautiful. The Starfighter game mode was also greatly improved from the first game. There were far more maps added, and these maps each had a unique draw to them, such as fighting a Lucrehawk or battling around a Camino city. Starfighters just in general felt better in every way, and every match was far more structured like the DLCs for the first game, rather than just a bunch of random players in an empty sky like how it was on the release of Battlefront 1. Even though there are only 3 classes of Starfighters, the star card system helped add a degree of variety to them, while ships still feel appropriate for their intended role. There was also a far wider variety and quantity of capital ships and corvette ships scattered around, really giving the feel that you were fighting in a hectic dogfight. Most likely due to the complaints of one being sorely missing from its predecessor, Battlefront 2's marketing heavily featured the campaign of the game. This campaign saw players take on the role of Iden Versio, a member of the Empire's Special Forces Squad Inferno Squadron, with it showing how the Empire dealt with the aftermath of the Battle of Endor and the destruction of the second Death Star at the hands of the Rebel Alliance. The plot isn't anything special, with essentially the quote-unquote big plot twist of you changing sides being easily predictable from the very first trailer of the campaign, since we all know EA lacked the guts to have us play as a solely Empire campaign. The campaign has 13 different levels which happen across a wide variety of planets and locations, and we didn't simply play as Iden on foot in every level. With some levels we had space combat, and some levels let us play as a variety of heroes from the multiplayer, such as Leia Organa, Luke Skywalker and Han Solo. The campaign also had these extremely odd sort of stealth sections, and to be honest, it is a bit of a pointless addition. The campaign was also a good introduction to the star card system for many players, with it having different star cards in certain levels, as well as allowing players to pick which star cards they had when they replayed the campaign, which did go to add a certain amount of variety and replayability, especially when combined with the different weapons. The campaign is also kind of random, with most levels feeling largely disconnected from each other. This actually often happens because of the hero sections, with most of the time them just feeling sort of randomly shoved in, like the developers thought their appearance was mandatory or something. But to be fair, it is a good chance for players to get used to these heroes for the multiplayer though. All of this isn't helped by the fact that the story isn't particularly interesting because it lacks any sort of individuality, with it really feeling like a plot we've seen so many times before in other games. That doesn't mean the campaign is boring by any means, since the gameplay is highly enjoyable and it can be a blast to play at times. For me personally, the campaign is a real shame, since the original Battlefront 2, that being the 2005 one, had a campaign which missions were also widely disconnected, but still managed to be really iconic and memorable, which the newer one unfortunately fails to do. The game also got criticism for lacking much in the way of offline content on release. Apart from the campaign, we had only the arcade, which had a degree of solo and two-player co-op content, but it was all extremely basic. To be fair, this was and is extremely common in modern day shooters, and normally this wouldn't be too much of a problem, but this was a Battlefront game. The original Battlefront and Battlefront 2 are two games which are held in high regard and featured the ability to have large battles online or offline with bots. That's why it was extremely disappointing that what was supposed to be a reboot of this series lacked any offline content, although this is something which would later be fixed, to its credit. The game was met with extremely mixed reviews. Mostly people seemed to like the gameplay, however many were not able to look past the loot box controversies, and is still often brought up as a critique of the game despite their removal. Within only a few weeks after the game's initial release, the first new season of content was released. This came out on the 5th of December and was based around the film The Last Jedi, which was released around the same time. The first week of the season allowed players to take part in challenges in either the First Order or the Resistance in order to obtain loot boxes. The main content of the season came in week 2, with Captain Phasma and Finn being added as ground heroes, while Talia Lintra was added as a space hero. We also got 2 new maps, the first of which was the Galactic Assault map, Abandoned Rebel Outpost set on Crate. So while The Last Jedi movie was honestly pretty disappointing, this map is actually really good. On Galactic Assault is one of my favourites in the entire game, especially the first phase. This partly because of just how beautiful the map looks, especially when the speeders tear up the ground creating red smoke. It truly feels like the Resistance is on the verge of defeat, which is really pushed by the lack of any real options to deal with the First Order's TIE fighters and walkers. The battle only gets more intense in the second phase, as the First Order have a wide array of angles to approach from, and the third phase is just truly chaotic. The space map that came with it was also pretty enjoyable, but there isn't really much to say about it apart from the fact it's pretty decent. The worst part of the season by far though was the story content called Resurrection. This was made up of 3 different missions set around the time of the sequel trilogy. These missions are bad. Like, really bad. The first mission especially is terrible, with it making the usually fast-paced combat of space slow and boring. The other 2 missions aren't much better, and to be honest, they are a chore to play. But I guess the one good thing I can say about the campaign missions is that they are free, so I don't really have much room to complain, I suppose. The majority of the content for The Last Jedi season was all released in the first few weeks. However, the challenges did continue up until January 14th, with a new limited time game mode, Jetpack Cargo, being added shortly after. The next set of content we would get was the Night on Endor update, which primarily featured the Ewok Hunt game mode. This game mode is one of my favourite themed game modes added to the game, since there's just something about being hunted in the night through the forests of Endor by a legion of small angry Ewoks. This was the time that the controversial crystals were re-added to the game. However, this time while being purchasable for cash, their usefulness was limited to only cosmetic items. It was surprising that EA of all companies seemed to be sticking to their promise of keeping pay to win out of the game. However, it was too little too late for some people. We also got a bunch of hero and class appearances and the promise of more to come in the second season of the game. The second season would be another movie tie-in season, with it being based on and released around the same time as Solo. This season was initially released on the 16th of May 2018, with it having a variety of weekly and daily challenges for players to take part in, as well as new game modes and skins for Leia and Lando. The map of Jabba's Palace from the first EA Battlefront was added to the second game, with it being playable for the game modes Blast, Heroes vs Villains, as well as the new game mode Hero Showdown. The second new game mode finally added some new PvE single player content, with Starfighter Custom Arcade, which allowed players to play Starfighter dogfights in arcade with either one player or two player split screen. We were still unable to do full matches in single player, but we were getting there. The season also saw the addition of the Lando and L337's Millennium Falcon. We would only get challenges until the second part of the season was released on June 11th, with the main content being added on June 12th. The biggest new addition was the new solo tie-in movie map, Kessel Coxium Mine. This map was playable on the game modes Blast, Hero Showdown, Heroes vs Villains, and the new game mode Extraction, which was updated from the previous game. Unfortunately, the Kessel map is nowhere near as good as the Crate map from the previous season. To its credit, the map does look good, but none of this really stands out, and it often just ends up being forgettable for me. There was also a variety of new skins for Han Solo, Lando, and Chewie based off the film. If there was one type of content which the community wanted the most, it would certainly be more Clone Wars content. After all, we were still missing so many of the most iconic Clone Wars era characters like Obi-Wan and Anakin, not to mention Ahsoka, Rex, Mace Windu, Ventress, Cad Bane, Vizsla, and so many more. However, many, myself included, had begun to lose hope that we would be getting any major Clone Wars content. After all, the last two seasons had been film tie-ins, but to our excitement, it was announced at EA Play 2018 that we would be getting new Clone Wars content. It was also announced that the way we would be getting content would be drastically changed. Instead of getting large updates every once in a while, with nothing much between them, we would instead be getting smaller, more frequent updates every month. The majority of the released content was released periodically, almost over the course of an entire year, from October 2018 to September 2019, although there was the Elite Corps update in August, and a rework of the squad system in September 2018. The Elite Corps update allowed players to once again purchase emotes and victory poses of crystals and credits, while also adding the first batch of new Clone Trooper appearances. The main changes to the squad system was that now players could be a part of permanent squads consisting of 2 or 4 members, and squad mates could now spawn on each other when not in combat. This update also brought with it the second batch of Clone Trooper appearances. The next update came on the 30th of October, and with the exception of a rework to how star cards were applied to heroes and villains in regards to health, the only big addition was General Grievous being added to the game. On December 28th, we got the release of the Battle of Geonosis update. The main features of this update was certainly the addition of the new Geonosis map, Tripper Hive, and Obi-Wan Kenobi. This map is one of my personal favourites, since I do quite enjoy it, at least when playing on the clones on Galactic Assault, since the map can become extremely chaotic for the Geonosian sand blinding vision, and it has plenty of room for snipers and flanking, although it is certainly one of the most controversial maps added to the game, with many players not being able to stand it, and for, to be honest, pretty fair reasons, such as it being unbalanced. The map also has enough room for it to make full use of the new vehicles, the Bark Speeder and the STAP, as well as the objective vehicle, the ATTE. To go with Obi-Wan, the 212th Attack Battalion skin was added for Clone Troopers. The December update didn't feature anything really noteworthy, other than the General Kenobi skin, some UI improvements, and the reworked squad system being added to Blast. In January, we got the introduction of Count Dooku to the game, while in February we got Anakin Skywalker, as well as the 501st Legion and Coruscant Guard skins for the clones. It would be in March that we would be getting our next new map and game mode as part of the Capital Supremacy update. I think we all knew we would never be getting to board enemy capital ships using starfighters while a battle raged on in space around us, like we did in the original Battlefront 2, but the Galactic Supremacy game mode was a good compromise in my opinion. The game mode saw players battling over control points on a planet's surface before the winning team takes the battle to the enemy's capital ship, where if they fail to destroy it, the battle returns to the ground again. On release of the update, the map added for this game mode was the Geonosis Pipeline Junction West map. While I really do love the Capital Supremacy game mode, I do have to admit it has some problems. Most notably, some stages aboard the capital ship, which can sometimes feel like a meat grinder, especially once you get to the inner sections of the ships. Capital Supremacy matches can also be extremely long, since if you have two equally matched teams, you can have games that go on for upwards of an hour, which isn't everyone's cup of tea. However, some of my favourite memories in the EA Battlefront 2 have been on Galactic Supremacy, and it has become one of my favourite game modes. At the same time, we got the introduction of the new Infiltrator classes, the ARC Trooper and the Commando Droid. Oh, just as a side note, the Capital Supremacy update added hands down the best skin of all time for any character. The April update, Giants Above Kashiro, brought the Kashyyyk map, Kashiro Beach, to Capital Supremacy, as well as adding the Princess Leia skin for Leia. A month later, the same was done for Kamino, and the target system in Heroes vs Villains was changed to be more like Blast, as well as having the level caps raised to 1000 for all classes. The Where Are Those Droidicas update was released on June 26, 2019, which to no one's surprise finally added droidicas to the game and the TX-130 tank. The addition of new vehicles is always nice, but the droidicas was something else. While they aren't really balanced the best, they are one of my favourite classes to play in the game, and really are iconic of the Clone Wars era. The Naboo map feed was reworked to be added to Capital Supremacy, and we also got the General Skywalker skin based off Anakin Skywalker's appearance in the early Clone Wars seasons, and more clone skins for the 212th Recon Division and the 41st Scout Battalion. The next update was the Roger Roger update, which added way too many hero star cards for me to list, with them all being aimed to replace the Health on Kill star cards. There was another rework of Capital Supremacy, with the ticket counter being replaced with a timer, giving players a set time to win before having to go back to the ground stage. The ground phase was also reworked so that you could now spawn on captured objectives. Heroes and Villains got the Republic Attack Cruiser and Separatist Dreadnought maps finally added to it, while the droids also finally got some new skins, with the Pilot, Jungle and Training skins being added. Although, let's be honest, it was clear which side was getting more love in the skin department. The final update of the Clone Wars content was the Cooperation update, which was released in September 2019, with it marking the end of the almost 1 year Clone Wars themed updates. We once again got another map, with the Felucia map Tagata being added for Capital Supremacy. Visually, it was a very different map to the other Capital Supremacy maps we'd gotten so far, with it feeling appropriately alien and accurate to its previous appearances in games, TV and shows. The new class introduced to even out the Republic and the Separatists enforcers was the Clone Commando. Probably the most important thing about the Commando being added was that it had an anti-vehicle ability, which to some degree did help to deal with the fact that vehicles were really able to dominate in larger maps. The Cooperation update also brought with it 2 new game modes. The first of these game modes was Co-op, which allowed players in teams of 4 to fight with and against AI with reinforcements, heroes and vehicles being playable. While Co-op is a good addition to the game, my favourite of the 2 new game modes added during the Cooperation update is certainly the return of instant action from the original Battlefront 2. This would finally allow players to take part in offline matches against AI, while allowing for the use of heroes, reinforcements and vehicles. There was also the option to customise certain aspects of instant action, and there was more options added as time went on. The only new skin we got in this update was the Farm Boy skin for Luke Skywalker, which is one of those skins I'm sort of surprised wasn't added earlier, and the only emote we got being the Kenobi emote for Maul. There was also a number of smaller changes, including numerous quality of life changes, and the removal of daily crates, as well as Extraction being merged with Strike for matchmaking purposes. The Clone Wars updates were probably the high point of the game's life cycle for me, since while the other 2 seasons had been good, they didn't really have much in the way of new content after the initial release. Whereas the Clone Wars updates were more spread out, as well as having far more content to it. However, the game wouldn't be able to make only Clone Wars updates forever, and soon, the other eras would get some much needed love. The next main update for the game was the October 23rd Another Night on Endor update, which saw the return of Ewok Hunt, but this time with a new map, as well as Battle of Yavin inspired outfits for Luke and Han. The other big additions brought in this update was the addition of the Felucia Tagata map to Heroes vs Villains, as well as the 501st Legion skin being changed to the default appearance for the Jet Trooper. There was no new update for the next month, but in December the Celebration update came, with it introducing a bunch of new skins and quality of life changes. To be honest, this update and Another Night on Endor update were really more filler than anything to act as a bridge between the Clone Wars content and the rest of the content to come in the game. At the same time as the Celebration Edition update, a new edition of the game was released called the Celebration Edition, which came with lots of appearances, emotes, voice lines and victory poses. The next big update was only 12 days later, with the Rise of Skywalker update dropping on December 17th, 2019, and it being the 3rd film tie-in season or update added to the game. While being based off just a pure mess of a film, just as with The Last Jedi, this season of content is actually really good. By sheer amount of new content added, I would say it adds more than The Last Jedi season or the Solo season. Like the other two film-based content seasons, we did get a single new map, the Klosslands, set on Ajan Kloss. Just as with the other film-based maps, I do rather like this one, with it being playable on co-op, heroes vs villains, hero showdown, and instant action, although Supremacy will be added to the map in the next update. There was also the introduction of a total of 4 new reinforcement classes: the Cathek Spy, Ovesian Gunner, First Order Jet Trooper, and the Sith Trooper, all of which are insanely fun to play, especially the Jet Trooper. Of course, there was also a wide variety of quality of life updates and balancing changes to the game, as well as new skins for Rey, Finn, and Kylo based off their appearances in the film. The next update was meant to come out in late January 2020, but a game-breaking bug was found during testing of the update, so it was delayed until February 3rd. When I first saw the trailer for this update, I was completely shocked and genuinely thought it was
an out-of-season April Fool's joke.
This was because we were getting the 2 new heroes, BB-8 and BB-9E, which to me were odd, as I never really thought that BB-8 nor a random droid from The Last Jedi would be added into Battlefront 2. It was surprising that they were picked over, say, Hux or Poe. The even more surprising thing is that these two were well balanced and incredibly fun to play, with them not being pushovers by any means. As well as the 2 new heroes, we also got Capital Supremacy added to the sequel era, with the maps for Jakku, Takodana and Ajan Kloss being available. On the 26th of the same month, we would get the next update, which would bring the focus back to the Galactic Civil War, with it most notably adding 2 new infiltrator classes, the ISB Agent and of course the Ewok Hunter. I wouldn't say these reinforcements were as requested as the reinforcements we got for the Clone Wars, but they were both welcome additions, even the Ewok Hunter, which I find hilariously ridiculous, with it being a small death ball of fur. Each class also got new weapons, for the E11D for the Assault, the T21 for the Heavy, the DL18 for the Officer, and the Cycler Rifle for the Specialist, all of which were unlocked through co-op. This update was what finally brought co-op to the Age of Rebellion, with Endor, the Death Star 2, Hoth, Yavin 4, Kessel, and the 2 Tatooine maps being available to play. At this point, the game had so much more content in it than it had at launch, and had changed into an almost completely different game in regards to monetization. What none of us were aware of until just before the next update's release was that we were reaching the end of the new content for the game, and that the next update in April would be the last full update we got, with it getting a patch on the 28th of May. This update, called the Battle on Scarif, was released on April 19th, and as the name suggests, it brought with it the beautiful Scarif map from the first EA Battlefront to the second game. It is somewhat appropriate that the last content update was a Scarif update, as the Scarif DLC was the last DLC for the original EA Battlefront, and was certainly one of the best DLCs released for Battlefront 2's predecessor. The Scarif map could now be played on instant action, hero showdown, heroes vs villains, co-op missions, and supremacy. While on the topic of supremacy, the Death Star 2, Hoth, Yavin 4, and Tatooine maps were also changed to be playable on supremacy as well. However, there was a change in that for the Age of Rebellion, supremacy was solely ground-based with no capital ship sections like the other 2 eras. There was also a variety of single-player and co-op content, with attack and defend missions being added under instant action, as well as the MC-85 Star Cruiser and the Resurgent-class Star Destroyer being available for co-op missions. The final update gave new Episode 9 inspired appearances for the Emperor, Rey, and Kylo Ren, as well as a new appearance for Darth Maul based off his design in Rebels. The trooper appearances we got in this update were the Pathfinder, Shore Trooper, Zabrak Rebel, and Zabrak Resistance. Before we knew it, we had gotten the final update, and that was it. There was no new content coming for the game. This certainly disappointed a lot of fans, with some even saying they would be willing to purchase DLC type content. I think that this truly encapsulates the massive change in perception the game went through. Battlefront 2 started off with an extremely poor start in many aspects, with many writing the game off, yet DICE and EA stuck by the game, giving us new free content for over 2 years, and actually responding to a lot of the criticism and changing the game accordingly. I truly cannot believe that EA of all companies went along with this, especially when you look at the disaster of Battlefield 5. One of the most annoying parts about this is that EA seemed to be behind the stopping of updates so that they could move the DICE team away from working on the Star Wars license and instead have them work on the next Battlefield game, making it seem unlikely there will be a Battlefront 3 anytime soon, if at all. Seriously, what is it about the Battlefront license and not making it to the 3rd game? Despite all of this, I think that Battlefront 2, while it did have a rough start, truly did end on a high note, and is actually worthy of the Battlefront name.